Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I am very excited about our guest. Phil Magness is an economic historian specializing in 19th century American history and a senior research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research and author of the book 1619 Project, a Critique. Phil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I say we have a continuing series on celebrating bravery in the liberty movement. And you may be one of the most unsung heroes just with your efforts, part of the 1619 Project. And then, that's originally why I wanted to talk to you. And then just what your efforts with exposing the emails with your Freedom of Information Act for Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci between them. For those who don't know the story, can you just give us a brief background on Great Barrington Declaration and just with a specific focus of just how you started the process of being suspicious enough to ask for an FOIA request?
Right. So you go all the way back to October of 2020, and it's really that first weekend in October. AIER hosted a small conference on the pandemic response policy on our campus. And as part of that conference, we brought in a team of 3 doctors who had been working on the COVID-19 pandemic for the previous year. And that's Sunetra Gupta from Oxford University, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford. And basically hosted them there for a long recorded interview with several members of the media, and then a Q&A session about their assessments of the lockdowns, the policy that had basically been dominating the pandemic response since the outset in March 2020. And what they did is over the course of the weekend, they made a systematic case against lockdowns, against their effectiveness, pointed out some of the harms that were being neglected. And at the end of the conference, the 3 scientists decided to put together their views in a one-pager statement of principles arguing against lockdowns called the Great Barrington Declaration. And we launched this almost immediately after the conference, and did so with a little bit of media fanfare. So the 3 authors were interviewed the next morning, I think, on Fox News. But over the course of the next 2 to 3 days, much to our surprise, much to anyone's surprise that had been involved in it, the Great Barrington Declaration, it turned out to really tap into a note of reservations that a lot of people were having about lockdowns, and this thing went viral. It started gathering tens of thousands of signatures on the internet, on the website that was set up for it. Started being picked up. I
remember the early excitement.
Yeah, media was all over the world calling about it and interviewing the doctors. They started appearing not only in the U.S. press, but the U.K. press. And it was really starting to disrupt this pro-lockdown narrative that had dominated our public health response, both in the U.S. and in many other countries around the world. Well, that's when Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins jump into the story. So about 3 days after the Great Barrington Declaration went live and started to go viral, Fauci and Collins took notice. And as we discovered in these Freedom of Information emails that we obtained, Collins on 3 days after the Great Barrington Declaration came out, sent an email to Fauci and other members of his senior staff ordering them to, quote, take down, end quote, the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration, calling the 3 scientists fringe scientists. Oddly enough, Collins says these are 3 fringe epidemiologists, and they even have convinced a 4th, a Nobel Prize winner, Michael Levitt, to join their efforts. So he's denouncing top scientists from top institutions with impeccable credentials as fringe epidemiologists. And then he orders Fauci and his other subordinates at the NIH to take down the Great Barrington Declaration. And we're not talking about taking it down as in rebutting its arguments, offering a scientific case against it. This was a media campaign to discredit and smear and basically trash the reputations of the authors of the Declaration itself, so they wouldn't have to engage its arguments.
When I saw this, I was immediately reminded of ClimateGate from 2009.
Right.
And presumably Russian hackers released emails of top climate scientists in the UK conspiring to discredit scientists who questioned the climate change orthodoxy.
Right.
You know, it's like you don't get 98% of climate scientists agreeing without a little intimidation.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing. And you know, regardless of the issues involved in here, I think it speaks to a politicization of science that people like Anthony Fauci are very reluctant to admit outright. In fact, Fauci keeps going before Congress and going before the cameras and saying that he represents the science, he's above the politics, he's outside of the fray of the political debate, and he wants simply scientific advice to guide what the policy outcomes are. Well, these emails, they reveal a very different side to Anthony Fauci than his public presentation of his own self and his own motives. They reveal Fauci as kind of like this J. Edgar Hoover-esque political actor. Yeah. This guy that's working the bureaucracy, is working media campaigns behind the scenes, is contacting people in the press to make sure that they're carrying his talking points, is feeding the press exactly what they want to hear because he knows he can manipulate the political message and actually steer it away from the substance of scientific debate and onto the political response, which he, as we know, has basically been the dominant figure in the U.S. Component of that since COVID outbreak started.
Yeah, and I mean, ClimateGate was basically swept under the carpet because they investigated themselves, and it turned out there was no wrongdoing. It's all of the credibility of a Chris Christie traffic investigation.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
But I was expecting to see a much bigger reaction after getting caught red-handed, but so many people in the media and just the general scientific establishment, even those in the liberty movement, they're just not fully ready to admit they were backing the wrong guy. So, I mean, I've heard excuses like these are just scientists trying to rally others for their view.
Yeah. Well, there's a sunk cost element to the entire COVID debate where people bought into the lockdowns in March 2020, and they've been very, very reluctant to admit the error there. And that's true both within the liberty movement and more broadly in the media. I think what we're seeing with the reaction to the Fauci emails, so I kind of watched this play out in real time after I released them. So the first reaction was, well, these are obviously fake. We don't have any proof. We don't have any verification that that these emails are legitimate because I posted them on Twitter and Facebook and a couple places and indicated, yeah, I just obtained these through a Freedom of Information Act. And I'd say within about 12 hours, some of the same emails were contained in a batch released by the House Investigative Committee, the Democrat side, of course, with all sorts of political spin in favor of Fauci, but they were found in the documentation that was released. So when people put two and two together and realized that, yes, this is a legitimate set of emails that we got, they started to change their narrative. The next thing they said, well, Collins didn't order Fauci to take down the scientists themselves. He ordered them to take down the premises of their scientific argument. But if you dig deeper into the emails, that's not what Fauci does. In fact, he goes straight for the political attack. He goes for a takedown on the character and reputations of the scientists, not on the premises of their argument. He starts circulating political op-eds to attack them. So that ends up being wrong. And then the third phase of the response that we see is the very same people that were initially saying, well, these emails, we don't have any verification that they're real, or that Fauci was just attacking the scientific arguments here. Now they've changed their narrative to assert, well, the Great Barrington Declaration was irresponsible, and in fact, it is fringe science, and therefore Fauci and Collins were right to attack it the way that they did. So it's a shifting narrative that's almost comical if you look at it from a distance, and yet this is playing out in real time in the way that people are rationalizing and trying to defend what I think is frankly inexcusable behavior by two top scientists who control multi-billion-dollar budgets at the top of the federal health agencies that they sit at.
Phil, have you heard any additional context or excuses from Fauci and Collins themselves on why they wrote that in those emails? Like, there's always some context behind an email, right? Maybe they met in person beforehand and were talking about it. Have you heard anything like that? And do you find any of their rationalizations to be justified or excusable?
Well, there's the other interesting thing about the Freedom of Information request. Even though we got quite a few, what I'd say are like smoking gun style emails in it, there are substantial redactions throughout that. And the government can invoke various statutes to assert that some information contained in emails that are public records are still technically private. So there is some legitimacy to certain redactions, although it's really hard to figure out if they're appropriately using that power.
Right.
And you find that in the release they gave them, there are entire pages of emails that are just blanked out with a black block of over the text. So they were heavy-handed on what they redacted. We don't know what occurred exactly in that part of the email chain. What we do know is that the timing all happened right between this call from Collins to take down the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. And then a few days later, I think it was October 16th, that was the scheduled White House Task Force coronavirus meeting. So the coronavirus task force that Pence and Fauci and Deborah Birx are all on. Scott Atlas was the one of the few sensible voices there coming from the other
wouldn't
side.
let him in.
Yeah, so that they had that meeting scheduled for October 16th, and all of these redacted emails are in about the week in between Collins's call to take down the Great Barrington Declaration and the first COVID task force meeting where it was possible that it was going to come up. So it seems that Fauci and Collins and some of the other actors at the NIH were engaged in preparations for a media campaign against the Great Barrington Declaration over the course of that week, and it's just all been redacted.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it. I think they felt a little rushed to come up with some argument against the Great Barrington Declaration. But if I can turn it to the Great Barrington Declaration itself, I understand that it's just a declaration basically of the principles behind their position.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you cover some of the actual evidence that supports some of the claims in there? For example, they say that, the lockdowns hurt the young people and damage the economy. What is there like some hard evidence you can present for that?
Yeah, I think we see the evidence all around us, and it's come out of the CDC. It's come out of media investigations. It's come out of just watching the economic numbers. I guess we want to break that down. What are the harms of lockdowns? And this is what the Great Barrington Declaration sought to highlight. Well, first, there are clear economic harms, and we saw this in very pronounced ways in the United States. Especially after that initial phase in March and April 2020, when some states started to reopen and other states remained closed. And then I think there were 8 states that never closed in the first place, but they're mostly rural states in the Western plains. But 8 states that never closed, and then there's another dozen or so that opened pretty rapidly. They opened in the late spring, early summer of 2020. Well, if you look at the economic data on the state level from each of these areas, the states that remained in lockdowns had substantially higher persistent unemployment for basically the next year, whereas the states that either stayed open or reopened had really low unemployment. So there's a core economic indicator. The lockdowns themselves, not the pandemic, is what put people out of work. So you see that on the economic side. If you move over to the CDC data on the public health side, one of the first statistics that really came out after the lockdowns was that substance abuse, that's everything from drug abuse, alcohol abuse, anything in that territory that the CDC tracks just skyrocketed right around March 2020, and it persisted over the next, the better part of the next year. And the most obvious explanation here is that people are locked in their homes. They're sitting at homes. They've lost their jobs. Well, what are they doing to spend their time? They're turning to a bottle of alcohol, or they're ingesting drugs, and you have a rapid spike in cases of substance abuse reports that are coming into hospitals and everything. Third one that we get, and this is a really tricky statistical area, is but the CDC surveys what they call suicide ideation, people that are contemplating committing suicide or threatening to commit suicide. And this is different from actually pulling off the going through with it, because those statistics are very hard to tease out exactly what's happening when and where, especially if you consider it across the population. But among young people, suicide ideation immediately shot through the roof. You started getting these horrifying surveys that were suggesting, I think one of them even suggested maybe as one in five young people had suicidal thoughts at some point during the lockdowns. So you get costs like this on mental health. There are other indicators that have since come out. We started to see missed cancer screenings when they delayed all the non-essential procedures at hospitals to try to clear a way for what they thought was going to be a wave of COVID patients. They suspended elective procedures. Well, that includes things like checking for breast cancer, checking for detectable types of cancer that, when caught early, can be very easily treated. What this means is that 5, 10, 15 years out from now, we're going to be dealing with another public health crisis of more severe cancer cases in areas and types of cancer that were simply missed due to the deferred cancer screenings during the lockdowns. These are just a few of the major costs that are associated with it. And up until the Great Barrington Declaration, almost nobody in the public health establishment was talking about any of these costs and what they meant for trade-offs of enacting this draconian policy of locking everything down. So over the course of the next few weeks after the Great Barrington Declaration, you also started to see media attention to all these different other areas of costs and harms associated with the lockdowns. And these are things that Fauci and Collins simply did not want to talk about.
Right. And I do want to circle back to just what inspired you to ask for the Freedom of Information, and was it just mainly around that October meeting? How did you decide what to ask for?
Well, one of the lessons that we took away from the experience after the Great Barrington Declaration, when it went viral, because we weren't anticipating it to take off as much as it did.
Right.
I think it caught everybody by surprise just how popular it ended up being. But we also noticed within a week or two after the declaration, the media attention on it turned from covering this as a novel alternative approach to the pandemic to some deeply personal vilification style attacks against the scientists, against AIER for hosting the conference, against almost anyone that was involved. Like personal defamatory attacks. The media started printing conspiracy theories that claimed that there were all these crazy secretive funding initiatives behind the Great Barrington Declaration. The reality of that, I can say this because I was at the conference, it was a small academic conference hosted in-house for maybe a dozen people total, inclusive of the reporters that are coming there. Those are not expensive to do, especially if you're doing it in a private facility. But they had all these crazy conspiracy theories started making their way into the media. So we knew something was coming from the other side. The first clear tip-off we got to that actually came out of the UK. And there's a scientist over there that's head of a private funding foundation, it's the main medical foundation called the Wellcome Trust. The scientist is by the name of Jeremy Farrar. And Farrar sits on one of the main advisory councils to Boris Johnson that was in favor of lockdowns. So he played a very similar role in the UK as someone like Fauci did in the United States. Well, Farrar wrote something of a memoir about his experience in the pandemic over the last year. And it's a very pro-lockdown, defensive memoir claiming he did everything right. And there's a really interesting passage in it, though, where he recounts how he reacted to the Great Barrington Declaration, and he relays this conversation with Dominic Cummings, who at the time was Boris Johnson's kind of like a Karl Rove figure, like a consigliere type political agent that worked with Downing Street. And he recalls this conversation with Dominic Cummings over the Great Barrington Declaration, where Cummings basically says, we need a media campaign to discredit this thing. Need a media campaign because this alternative narrative is gaining a foothold, and it's challenging what we're doing. So we need to take it down immediately. So it's almost the exact same thing that Collins turned out to have directed Fauci to do. This got my suspicions raised when we saw Farrar admitting this outright in his book, and I thought, well, I'm almost certain there's probably similar conversations going on over in the United States. Let's submit a Freedom of Information request and just see what comes of it. And we thought, maybe it'd be some chatter, some grousing in between Fauci and Collins and Birx about how they opposed this thing. Instead, it turns out to be that they actually waged a media campaign to discredit and try and destroy it.
And yeah, so that's in response to Collins calling for the discrediting. I mean, Fauci starts circulating a piece from Wired magazine, not a scientific journal, and basically accusing the lockdowns of being old news.
Yeah. So this is one of the most astounding things. So Wired magazine puts out this article immediately after the Great Barrington Declaration, like within a day or two, attacking it. It was one of the first attacks that we encountered.
The prestigious journal.
The prestigious journal, Wired magazine. You can read about the latest tech innovations and video games and stuff, and then their scientific assessment of the Great Barrington Declaration.
Do you happen to know why Wired magazine was interested in this?
I think it comes from a bias toward lockdowns that's really set in the journalist class, and I think they were simply representative of that. And they put this piece out, and it's an attack on the Great Barrington Declaration. And the whole argument is, well, the Great Barrington Declaration is arguing against a straw man from the past. The Great Barrington Declaration is a response to the lockdowns of March and April of 2020. But here we are in October. The world has reopened. This is all behind us. I'll paraphrase the article. It says the Great Barrington Declaration is quite literally arguing with the past, with a policy that's not coming back. Lockdowns are no more. So why should we pay attention to it? I mean, this has to be one of the most boneheaded media predictions of the entire pandemic. This is like October, the first week of October 2020. And within less than a month, the entire UK is back in full lockdown. Within less than a month, other states in the US are locking down. Countries around the world are locking down for round two. So, I mean, you want to talk about blowing a prediction. That the author of this thing, like his journalistic career, should probably be discredited by being just so absolutely atrociously wrong. And yet this is the article that Anthony Fauci finds off of Google and circulates around the highest levels of the NIH and says, here's our response to the Great Barrington Declaration.
And the thing is, it kind of worked.
Yeah. Sadly, it did. And we saw this. I knew this from back in October 2020 because I watched it play out in the media. That same argument that came from Wired magazine, the lockdowns are behind us, it's just a straw man, that went out like a talking point to all of the pro-lockdown side of epidemiology. And over the next few weeks, the initial response to the Great Barrington Declaration, you're seeing out of top lockdown scientists. I wrote an article for AIER documenting this. One fellow by the name of Greg Gonzalez, who's an epidemiologist at Yale, we also found was involved in some of the Collins and Fauci emails. He starts tweeting out that the Great Barrington Declaration is arguing against the lockdowns. Lockdowns are behind us. This is a straw man. We should not take this seriously. So that goes all over the place. I found another scientist at Harvard by the name of Bill Hanage who tweets out and says, lockdowns are behind us. The Great Barrington Declaration is arguing against a straw man. And this is early October 2020. On October 31st of 2020, so this is just a few weeks afterwards, Boris Johnson holds a press conference where he announces the UK is going back into lockdown. Well, Hanish tweets out, it's like a celebration of it. He says, "Finally, the UK is doing what we need to do. I've been hoping that they would do this for weeks." And you're sitting there reading this like, wait a minute. Just 3 weeks ago, you were insisting that lockdowns were behind us and that the Great Barrington Declaration was arguing against a straw man. So either this guy has the worst memory of any epidemiologist I've ever encountered, or he's outright being deceptive, dishonest about his intentions. And I think that was clear in quite a few on the lockdowner side. But this notion that the Great Barrington Declaration was arguing against a straw man, that lockdowns were behind us, it swept like wildfire for about 2 to 3 weeks after the declaration came out, until the lockdowns came back, and then they just quietly set it aside, pretended that they never made those claims.
So this takes a year to come out, basically. I assume a few weeks before they offered some sort of heads up. I went back and look, Collins announced his retirement in October.
Yeah.
And it took place on like basically the day after these emails came out. I don't want to sound too conspiratorial, but I'm just curious if you think there's any kind of,
Well, the thing I think with Collins is he sees the direction the overall pandemic policy is going. He sees that lockdowns are not delivering and never delivered on what they promised to bring us. He has also been under intense scrutiny, not just over this set of Freedom of Information Act emails, but intense scrutiny over whether the NIH, this agency, this billion-dollar agency he heads, funded gain of function research. We saw the congressional hearings that brought that out over the summer and early fall of last year, where it started coming to light that the NIH had not been fully forthright on its connection to some of these funding initiatives that were being taking place at the Wuhan lab. Now, we don't know whether the lab leak is the source of coronavirus or it comes out of the wild. That's still an open scientific debate. But we do know now that the NIH was much more involved in gain of function research than they ever wanted to let on in the early days of the pandemic. And I think that probably played a role in someone like Collins is thinking maybe it's time to get out. Maybe it's time to head off into retirement, and knowing that down the road that some of this information is certainly going to come to light. It turns out that our email request, just whether by coincidence or something else, did come out just like a day or two before Collins officially retired from the agency. And I don't know what to read into the timing there. I do know that it caught Collins off guard when he started getting media questions about this. So like the very next morning after we released these things, Brett Baer had Collins on for what was supposed to be a pretty friendly end of career, I'm retiring tomorrow type interview. And Baer hits him with the question and puts the image of his email up on the screen and says, can you explain this? Can you defend this? What were you doing here? And Collins is first kind of flabbergasted by it. You see in his facial expressions, he's really caught off guard, kind of stumbles around for a little bit, but then he decides that he's just going to dig in and double down and just goes in this outburst on Fox News and says, well, those are fringe epidemiologists. Those are fringe scientists. I was doing it because I stand by it is the gist of his message. So I think it went from him being caught off guard to him having the only answer that he could have that somewhat saved face was to go on the attack again and just own it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we didn't do it to you deserved it.
Right.
I saw that
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to, you mentioned you didn't want to sound conspiratorial. I actually don't care if people think I'm conspiratorial. I would like to bring up another idea that's a little out there, and that's the idea that these lockdowns were actually a strategy to ruin Trump's presidency. I think it's so absurd for these scientists to promote the lockdowns in the first place and then later evade all the evidence against them. I think one of the motives we should consider for them doing so is that they had this nefarious idea that it would affect Trump's presidency and get him out of office.
I mean, it's hard to say what went into all the different motives that brought people to support the lockdowns. What I can say, and I've worked extensively on this, written extensively on this, if you review the epidemiological evidence about lockdowns prior to about March 2020, they are very heavily frowned upon. You had top scientists from the World Health Organization, from Johns Hopkins University, the same people that were basically published the main coronavirus statistical dashboard, from the CDC, from basically every top health agency that discussed these options, and they were considering it for what if we had another influenza pandemic. So almost every major health body in the world had a pandemic response plan if we had a flu year that was that went much more severe than a typical flu that did basically the same thing coronavirus did. And all of these plans said, you know, lockdowns, the evidence from the past shows that they do not work. And then all of a sudden, around February, March 2020, that message goes silent, and some of the very same people, including Anthony Fauci, who previously were against lockdowns, they switch their positions and they become in favor.
Yeah.
It says almost overnight that this happens. And, you know, what's the motive here? It probably differs person to person. I do think that some saw a political opportunity in this to not only go after Trump, but to raise the profile and raise the authority and visibility of public health agencies like the NIH, like the Coronavirus Task Force, like the CDC, and think, hey, well, you know, this is our moment to shine. This is our moment to be the centerpiece of governance in the United States and governance worldwide. Why not seize the power? And lockdowns were a very effective tool for doing that. They've been very, very reluctant ever since then to even give up these emergency powers that they seized back in March 2020.
Yeah, I think there are two competing theoretical motives here, or like hypothetical motives. One is the power lust. They just are power. They want to grab power over society. But then the other one is that in order to do that, they need to get Trump out of office. So they're kind of like two heads of the same coin, you know, two sides of the same coin. Sorry. So on one hand, you need power, but in order to get that, you got to get Trump out. So
Right.
I think they knew that the lockdowns would cause all these problems. I mean, you had to know that there were negatives to the lockdowns and there are consequences for the economy. And one of the main drivers of who's going to become elected president is whether the economy is good or not.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there could have been other motives too, and that was also just a side benefit. I saw one of the great Barrington Declaration authors, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, being interviewed by Lex Friedman. Yeah. And by the way, Lex Friedman came on and he said that those emails, because he had just had Collins on a month before and was talking with him with reverence and respect. And he said seeing these emails broke his heart when it came to Collins.
Yeah.
And, you know, so, and Bhattacharya on there was saying that he was trying to create a serious discussion about helping the most vulnerable. And he was honestly flabbergasted at these mainstream media people coming up to him and saying, you know, what, you just want to let the virus rip?
Right.
I mean, that kind of attitude, it's not conspiratorial to speculate that that is a direct result of the email and them using, you know, Wired magazine for the devastating takedown.
Right. So in this, the let it rip narrative, because this became like almost instantly a talking point for the critics of the Great Barrington Declaration. If you read the Declaration itself, nowhere in the document does it say let it rip. In fact, quite to the contrary, the document proposes an alternative plan. They call it focused protection. And that means that you take measures to insulate places like nursing homes and hospitals that are exceptionally vulnerable. Maybe you take measures to figure out how to do food delivery for elderly people so they don't venture out in the public at a time when there's high transmission going on. Essentially, what a lot of people are doing now, de facto in the Omicron surge, is that, if you're elderly, if you have medical conditions that put you at higher risk, a lot of those people are staying home right now. And that's the wise thing to do. And the argument of the Great Barrington Declaration was that maybe we could systematize this and actually have a policy response. One of the ideas that I suggested way back at the conference, and that some others were floating around, what if we subsidized nursing home workers to live on site at the nursing homes and not go out into the general public during the peak outbreak periods? And some private nursing homes did this very effectively. They brought in RVs and parked them in the parking lot, and they asked their staff and said, hey, there's a pandemic. It's going to be really bad for the next couple of months. We'll pay you extra. We'll pay you overtime, and we will house you in these RVs that we have on site at our nursing homes just because we want to protect our patients. This was an idea that was entirely feasible. It was an idea that could have been funded at much lower cost than anything we did during the pandemic, and yet it's shoved aside. But this was the type of strategy that the Great Barrington Declaration wanted to advocate. What happened is people like Collins and Fauci and Wired magazine and all these media pile-on types that occurred in their wake, is they caricatured the Great Barrington Declaration. They called it a lit it rip strategy. They said they wanted to just turn the virus loose in society and not do anything. And then if you live, if you die, you die. Which sounds, it's incredibly cruel, but it's a complete, and I dare say, intentional caricature. You mentioned someone like Francis Collins. He's a scientist of some repute. He's a geneticist who a decade or more ago did some very valuable work in that field with the human genome recording and tracking of that entire project. He's intimately involved in it, but he becomes a bureaucrat at the NIH. And throughout his time in office, he's cultivated himself as kind of like this folksy, homely, country doctor style scientist.
I saw him singing.
Yeah, we have these videos of him with his guitar, and he's singing like songs about the coronavirus to the tune of Somewhere Over the Rainbow and Puff the Magic Dragon, and like a folk singer. And it was very effective at taking the edge off of him. It made him have this warm and glowing reception in the media, and I think that was by design. He wanted to cultivate that image of himself. But what you find in the emails is he's really a very heavy political operative, just as much as Fauci, just as much as anyone else in that type of a government office. So the emails kind of show the true Francis Collins, not the guy with the guitar out there. He's the operative behind the scenes who's ordering media attacks on policy positions that he disagrees with.
Yeah, you had a post on social media I loved. It's actually cutting on left libertarian lockdowners. Back a year ago, they were saying Twitter, Facebook, and Google are private companies, and if they want to suppress the Great Barrington Declaration, that's their right. It's not censorship unless the person doing it is the government. And then them again, after you've exposed these emails, they're like, so what if Collins and Fauci tried to suppress the Great Barrington Declaration? They were right to do so. And
Yeah.
so it's not just the scientific establishment. It's also large chunks of the liberty movement.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing that needs to be better understood, and I'm hoping to do some more research on it. I'm hoping to get some more freedom of information requests out on it, which we have filed. So the release we got was only the first batch, put it another way, because we have a much more extensive request in. But what you see here is Fauci, Collins, Birx, all of these figures are not just scientific authorities, scientific advisors. They're actually top government officials. Fauci's one of the most highly paid bureaucrats in the entire federal government. And he's been there for 40 years at the top of his agency, controls a multi-billion-dollar budget. These are government officials in the truest sense of the term. And when they are engaged in politicization of science, when they are engaged of calling upon their own staff, using their own staff resources to order a scientific hit job on people with dissenting viewpoints of the position that they've taken, that's no longer just a private company like Facebook saying we're going to censor misinformation. That's actually a government agency, a government authority acting on their own behalf to cultivate and to encourage private companies to censor. And what you find here, there's this weird circularity to it. So what does Facebook or what does Twitter do? Well, they say, we're going to censor COVID misinformation. How do we determine something is COVID misinformation? Well, we go to the NIH and the CDC. We go to what Anthony Fauci says. So the private company says, misinformation is determined by what Fauci says. Fauci says we're going to make this declaration and we're going to send it to our friends in the media of what we determine is valid or not. So you have the government actor working in their own official capacity is unmistakably trying to direct and shape how the media covers the policy discussion around these scientific issues. And he's unmistakably doing so in a way that puts his finger on the scale of that coverage with full knowledge that Facebook and Twitter and Google and all these other social media companies are going to turn around and rely on his authority to engage in censorship. So these left libertarians, I mean, I really view this as that they are making an argument of convenience. Back in the spring when they were saying censorship is not real censorship if it's done by a private company, they were saying that because it was the most defensible position that they had at the time. And then when it turns out that there's this direct chain of communication between Fauci, Collins, and the media and the censors themselves, they had to change their argument. So they start rationalizing, well, Fauci and Collins were right, so I'm glad that they did it. Mm-hmm. So it's a completely absurd logical process to justify post hoc a position that they already settled on. And what it really comes down to at the end of the day is many of these left libertarians are not libertarians at all. They're people that embraced medical fascism. They're people that embraced heavy-handed authoritarian approaches to the pandemic for a variety of their own neuroticisms, for a variety of their own political beliefs. Some of them actually probably thought that, hey, this is the way we're going to get Trump. I'm no fan of Trump myself, but some of the left libertarian approaches to that genuinely veered into deranged territory. And when it gets to the point that you're starting to shape pandemic response policies and embrace pandemic responses that penalize all of society just because you're on a crazy quest to get Trump, I think something's really askew there in your all that real time and an unfortunately large share of the liberty movement.
Yeah,
I think what you're saying about Fauci and the politicization of the pandemic response goes to something that's a big theme with Ayn Rand and objectivists, is that there's you have to separate the economy from government, because when the government sticks its nose into the economy, you get all these problems with corruption and
absolutely
people worrying about their jobs over actual science and medicine. So that's part of an issue I have with the Great Barrington Declaration. I think the declaration is great in terms of offering an alternative approach to handling the pandemic, but it's still based in an idea of government planning, right? It's offering this plan that the government could use instead of the lockdowns. But what we need, I think, is a philosophical declaration based on our rights and our right to engage in economic transactions without interference from the government.
Absolutely. So and I'm very sympathetic entirely to what you're saying there. What I noted, so the Great Barrington Declaration itself was an attempt to offer an alternative plan, and part of that is for practical reasons. We were looking for a way to take a different route than what had become the dominant policy of the U.S. government and governments worldwide. And part of that is you need an incremental approach. Part of that is you need to offer something else on the table that allows us a way out of this heavy-handed, almost draconian pandemic response that had been the dominant policy up until that point in the pandemic. So basically from March to October 2020, lockdowns had been the sole response, and they remain so for many months after that. We saw in the whole second wave. So the Great Barrington Declaration is not only offering an alternative plan, it's offering a plan that says, here's a way that we can back our way out of this extreme and erroneous response that we adopted back in the spring. So part of it is necessarily working in the policy sphere. At the same time, this is something I'd rank under the costs and harms of lockdowns. It's not only the empirical evidence that we talked about, the unemployment, the economic destruction, the rise in substance abuse, the rise in future cancer cases. Those are all very real harms and costs of lockdowns. But there's also a harm to what we could broadly call civil society caused by this approach. The adoption of the very idea that when a pandemic comes along, all rights are suspended. When a pandemic comes along, everything that we considered true and dear from our Bill of Rights on down to just basic human liberties, to move about the country, to exchange freely, to operate a business. The idea was that if Fauci decrees it, those rights can be trampled upon. The Bill of Rights can be set aside, and the government can do whatever it wants because it's in your own good from a public health reason. That is a harm and a cost of lockdown, because what it does is it erodes traditional protections of those civil liberties. It gives an exemption to the government that it can invoke at any moment if it wants to trample over your rights. I draw an analogy, you go all the way back to some of the stuff that we saw after 9/11 and during the Iraq War of the early 2000s. Yes, there needed to be a response of some sort to a major terrorist attack. Did we adopt the right response? I'd argue in hindsight, probably not, given the way that it all played out, and given especially the recent events in Afghanistan. But what we did see after 9/11 was a radical ratcheting up of government invasion into personal liberty and personal privacy. The creation of the TSA, the espionage programs that are reading your emails, reading your cell phone messages, things like that. All the stuff that Snowden revealed when he did that media document dump, it basically revealed the NSA spying program. All of this was ratcheted up under the justification that 9/11 was an emergency, and because of that emergency, we need to suspend basic civil liberties and civil rights in areas that the government has traditionally been barred from intruding upon. And we're seeing the same thing play out in the pandemic, is only now it's medical emergency rather than a terrorism emergency that's justified doing it.
And I think they use the word emergency as a sort of club to hit over people's heads and say, this is why we need all these regulations and mandates, because there's an emergency. So maybe it's this word, this concept emergency, that really needs to be defined and picked apart. Are we actually in an emergency that justifies such draconian laws?
And you see several of the state powers that are being used to continue the pandemic response are emergency powers that have to be renewed every 30 days or every 90 days. And now we're going on, 2 years of two weeks to flatten the curve under these same emergency jurisdictions, and very little legislative oversight. We saw some egregious cases abroad of this. I always point out to New Zealand, which they touted as like this lockdown utopia success story. Well, New Zealand went into lockdown without any legislative or parliamentary authority to do so at the outset of the pandemic. And their own Supreme Court, when the case finally made its way through the system, comes back and strikes it down and says, wait a minute, you impose these lockdowns without any legitimate constitutional power to do so. But then they gave themselves an out. They said, well, but what's done is done. I guess it's already happened. Nothing we can do about that now. And they've been in this almost hellish cycle of recurring lockdowns ever since. So it's a complete throwing off of any restraint that previously existed on government power, all through the notion that an emergency justifies it. And we know from history that when emergencies are invoked to justify things, not only is that power used ineptly and ineffectively, it's often abused in ways that are not connected to the original emergency. There's a creep that comes with it, and that creep comes at a long-term expense of the very rights and liberties that things like the Bill of Rights exist to protect.
Absolutely. Well, I want to get into 1619, but just as a last freedom of information question, I'm just curious. I mean, you got so much out of it. Should we all be asking for FOIA requests, or is that going to gum up the system for more targeted requests?
Well, the government is obliged within a certain reasonable time frame to deliver and answer Freedom of Information Act request if it pertains to a legitimate public record. And that's what a lot of these things are, is they are public records that by law are to be released into the public domain if requested. I think Freedom of Information Act requests have been a pretty effective tool in kind of pulling off the curtain that Fauci was operating behind, and we saw this with some of the previous releases. So that's how we started to discover that yes, the NIH was in fact dabbling in gain of function research, even though Fauci is publicly testifying that it's not. As some of his emails showed internal staff discussions where he's freaking out privately to staff over the fact that gain of function research has been funded by the NIH and that they need to have some sort of a response to it. So in terms of a tool, especially at a time when our government is less than forthcoming about its true motives, less than forthcoming about what it's trying, why some of these policies keep coming back and keep being reenacted, less than forthcoming about its own evaluation of the effectiveness of lockdowns, Freedom of Information Act is a way to bring some sunshine into that debate.
That's great. Well, as if standing up to the scientific establishment and exposing them wasn't enough to put a target on your back, I also want to talk about the 1619 project. It's really like these left libertarians, they're doing these projects like criminal justice reform and other things that the left won't get mad at them about. But yeah. I mean, you're hitting them where, this is not standard libertarian procedure to actually give them a substantive response, because as soon as 1619 came out, I mean, I said, okay, they've created a new narrative to prove that America was founded on slavery. Right. It's a classic pillar of the reparations argument that I would have with my friends over the years. And so, but you, again, like an investigator, you actually go in and debunk the data. I mean, you wrote a whole book about it, the 1619 yep. Project, a Critique. I saw a great tweet of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead author, scolding someone by saying, "You've read Magness, but not my book." So right. She acknowledges you're basically the main counter to her project. And I'm curious, I mean, if not for your efforts and the efforts of a few others that have called this out, I mean, do you think it would have been revised and substantially the way they have, and then tried to gloss over it as if the like you said, the first copy was a rough draft?
Right. This has been something astounding to watch play out in practice. It's a little background on myself. A large portion of my scholarly work is on the economics of slavery. I mean, this goes back decades. I've been working and writing on this subject and approaching it as an economic historian, approaching it as someone who does original research in that area. And I've got the publications to prove it. I mean, I probably do a little humble brag here, but I've got probably over 24 scholarly works on slavery in the Civil War era, most of which predate the 1619 Project. So when the New York Times announced that they were doing this thing, when they ran the first print edition in August 2019, I was initially excited, just as any scholar would be. It's like, hey, here's a mainstream media outlet that's covering the thing that you work on. Right. And then I start reading it and I find it's not a journalism venture similar to the Times' previous work on slavery. So if you go way back, I know it's a decade ago now, but between 2011 and 2015, the Times did this wonderful series called This Union that was a reflection of the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. And it ran hundreds of articles, almost like a daily article on some theme related to the history of slavery. They had hundreds of historians that contributed to it. I wrote like 3 or 4 pieces for them, but you actually had top scholars from universities around the world that were contributing to this thing. And it was a really nice, well-rounded, debate-oriented attempt to further our understanding of slavery and the Civil War. Well, fast forward half a decade later, and the 1619 Project's not that at all. It's the antithesis of that. It's a very one-sided, ideological echo chamber of Nicole Hannah-Jones and about a dozen or so, mostly journalists and political activists, a few historians, but certainly not. They're very light in the way of experts on slavery itself. Like the historians she uses are Kevin Kruse from Princeton, who's a 20th century historian that works on race relations in the urban and suburban South. But he's not an expert in slavery, and nor are any of the people that she actually used to write the essays on slavery. They end up being non-experts that have strong political opinions. And I'm reading through this thing, and I'm seeing, time after time again, basic factual empirical errors that are being passed off as true in the 1619 Project. So I start to critique it. The first pushbacks that I get from it come from, well, the usual sources on the academic left, people that are ideologically wedded, not just to the 1619 Project's narrative, but the big thing that they all jump in on, the big thing that that really attracts the left to it, is it's explicitly anti-capitalist. This is the essay by Matthew Desmond. It argues that slavery and capitalism are like joined at the hip historically, and as a result, capitalism is tainted by slavery. Capitalism today is infused with the brutality of slavery. Therefore, we need socialized healthcare, the Green New Deal, and a litany of progressive income redistribution. So it's a really odd but explicitly ideological argument. And of course, people that already agree with those politics are going to embrace it. The other thing there, though, that we saw, some of the early reactions from the left libertarians, and I won't name any names, although if you look around on Google, they're not hard to find. The response was, yes, Phil Magness's critiques of the 1619 Project are probably factually accurate, but we shouldn't be emphasizing that. Because the narrative the 1619 Project is trying to tell as a whole is more important than factual accuracy. It was kind of the read between the lines take on this. So that they were mad at me for calling attention to the factual defects because they thought this was an opportunity to virtue signal to the political left and align themselves with this trendy, fashionable new initiative of the New York Times.
Okay, so Phil, I read several of your essays on the 1619 Project, and I actually interviewed someone who was into this, and his main theme also was that capitalism is based in slavery, or that America was built on slavery. And I just think that's so ridiculous. I don't understand how people can maintain that belief when slavery existed long before America did and long before capitalism. It seems more like just an excuse to inject like a Marxist sort of view on capitalism in a different way, saying that capitalism is racist and therefore it's bad.
Yeah. No, here's the complexity here. As you know, this comes from the essay by Matthew Desmond in the 1619 Project. And Desmond's a sociologist of 20th century race relations, and yet for some reason Nicole Hannah-Jones picked him as the expert to write on the economics of slavery in the 18th and 19th century, something he had never worked on before. So that's interesting in itself. But what you find is exactly what you're saying. Desmond adopts an anti-capitalist narrative, ideological narrative from the outset of his essay. His title is Capitalism is Brutal, and basically you can thank slavery for that. And what this draws upon, it comes from a broader school of historiography. These are actual historians that work on slavery, but it's they refer to themselves as the new history of capitalism. It's a relatively recent development that popped up in the history profession, I'd say in the late 2000s, early 2010s. But it's very trendy at the Ivy Leagues. And what these historians do is they essentially assert that economic industrialization and growth in the 19th century is causally linked to plantation slavery. And that makes slavery capitalistic. And because slavery and capitalism are wedded together, that means that capitalism is illiberal and tainted in its origins and can be discredited today. So it is kind of a spin on a Marxian take, but I'd say it's even a garbled version of straight up classical Marxism that they're doing. It's a 21st century ideological spin to turn slavery into a mechanism to attack capitalism. I've been very critical of this literature since basically its inception in the early 2010s is when I started working on and writing and responding to it. And what you find in the new history of capitalism school is not only this ideological adherence to anti-capitalism, but the tactics and arguments that they make are exceedingly flimsy to draw this connection. So basically they connect slavery to capitalism through little more than semantic or word games. What they do is they redefine slavery as capitalism, and they'll point out some really superficial characteristics of slavery. They'll say, well, plantations used accounting books, double entry accounting. Double entry accounting is also used in corporations today. Therefore, corporate practices today, whenever they use an accounting book, they're really drawing on the plantations. So it's a really kind of a farcical argument, because we know that accounting books are not exclusive to plantations. They actually predate them by centuries. They go back to banking enterprises in Italy in the 14 and 1500s, if you look at the deep history of it. But you've got this farcical narrative that they put together of trying to attach anything and everything that's slightly economic about the plantation system to capitalism, and then they'll assert that therefore capitalism is tainted. The other thing they do is they engage in statistical misconduct, statistical fraud. So Ed Baptist is the author of one of the main books in this genre, and he reinvents the formula for calculating GDP to argue that prior to the Civil War, that slave-produced cotton accounted for 50% or more of the United States GDP. And he does this through this double and triple counting mechanism of his own invention, his own design. And I can't decide whether this is intentional malice or economic incompetence. It's probably a mixture of both. But the gist of it is the reality is cotton made up maybe 5 to 6% of U.S. Economic output prior to the Civil War. He inflates that to 50% to assert that cotton is like this driver of the American economy. It basically rehabilitates the old Confederate argument that cotton is king and cotton reigns with its scepter over the entire economy of the world. That's what they've adopted as their own position. And yet they've done so in exceedingly flimsy, non-rigorous, ideologically tinged scholarship, and yet that's presented now in the 1619 project as if it's an absolute fact and truth.
Well, one indication, I think, of it being more malicious and not honest is that they evade your arguments against them or your evidence against their positions. If I think in one of the articles I read, you mentioned that someone was responding to the 1619 project and pointing out, maybe it was you or some other historians who pointed out all these errors with their position, and then they just ignored the debate. They just left the debate and then went on as if their premises continued to be true. And I think that's an indication that they know they're wrong, they're dishonest, and there's something malicious going on. And another indication is that they're using this correlation argument where they're correlating spreadsheets that the slave owners used with Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and as if there's a link there, between slavery and I guess Microsoft now represents capitalism.
I guess, yeah. It's
But yeah, there's some link there that they're saying, but it's really just this absurd correlation that they're noticing, and you can notice all kinds of weird correlations. I'm sure slave owners used cups as well, and we use
right.
cups, and so
It
therefore,
really is that level. One thing I point out, the Soviet Union used accounting books. It had very sophisticated accounting books, because when you take a price mechanism out of an economy and you take the profit motive out of an economy, some of the self-regulating mechanisms of market exchange are no longer there to allocate scarce resources. So what did the Soviets do? They invent very, very complex accounting manuals with the inputs and outputs tracked and labor capacity tracked, and they try to centrally plan an economy. Is the Soviet gulag also capitalism now because they used accounting books on their forced labor camps? I think anyone but a crazy person would think that is absolutely absurd to call the Soviet gulag capitalistic because they use accounting books. And yet this is essentially the type of argument that they're applying to plantations now.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like it's more about a payday because there were 6 times as many slaves in Brazil, but they're not focused on all the double entry action going on down there. In response to some of your early criticism, I heard Nicole Hannah-Jones say that the 1619 Project is not a work of history, but a work of journalism.
Yeah, so this is where I'd go so far as to call it's like Schrodinger's 1619 project. It's history when it wants to be, but it's also not history when that's convenient. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, I mean, there is an interesting story here. I still make the argument that the 1619 project could have been fixed early on after its publication. It could have been corrected to deal with the errors. The errors were only really affecting 2 or 3 out of the dozen or so essays that appeared in the original version, and there were egregious errors, but they were confined into those essays, and you really could have salvaged the thing. But the New York Times, rather than using that opportunity to expand the project in a constructive way, to respond to and engage with critics, to make necessary corrections, they just dug their heels in and doubled and tripled down on like this incorrigible approach to that they were not going to reconsider anything in the 1619 project. And I think the big driver of that was Nicole Hannah-Jones herself. She took it as a point of insult to her pride that anyone would offer criticism of the historical merits of some of her narrative and some of her claim, and the same for her authors like Matthew Desmond. So she reacts not by addressing her critics, but she lashes out, and we saw this for those of us that were involved in the debate in the fall of 2019, saw it firsthand. James McPherson, one of the really prominent Civil War historian, gave an interview where he critiqued it, and Nicole Hannah-Jones tweets out, says, "Who considers McPherson preeminent? I certainly don't." And like this tweet, the subtext between it is like she had probably never even heard of who McPherson was before she goes on the attack against him. In another case, I think Gordon Wood and Victoria Bynum and James Oakes, they all give interviews critiquing the 1619 Project. These are very well-regarded, well-known Civil War historians at the top of the profession. And her response is, "Well, I don't really care. These are white historians." So it's like responding to substance with ad hominem attack. And I got the same version of ad hominem attack. She went after me. She tried to attack my credentials to even be working on slavery because,
Right.
I come from a public policy school. I study economic history, not a traditional history department, history PhD program. But I study the economic history of slavery. And she's like, "Well, Phil Magness isn't an expert in that because he didn't get his degree at the right university."
And
But it's a little more than a ad hominem, right? A normal ad hominem would be like, "You're dumb, you're an idiot, therefore you're wrong." But this one is based on racism. You're white, therefore you're wrong.
It's maliciously so. So I think Nicole Hannah-Jones's behavior has been honestly unbecoming of a professional journalist. and it's gotten worse over the course of the 1619 Project debate as the criticism intensified. She's just turned into like this personal vilification against anyone and everyone that questions the project. And in doing so, she revises her own history. So this was the big revelation that I discovered. I want to say it was about September of last year. As she went on the news, she went on CNN and she declared that it was never the purpose of the 1619 Project to displace 1776 as America's true founding, because she had been taking some criticism from that. I think Trump had tweeted something and said, well, this project is trying to displace 1776. She goes on CNN and says, no, that was never the intent at all. And not only myself, but a whole bunch of mainstream journalists were watching and listening to this, and we start scratching our heads. Wait a minute, you have given multiple public speeches and lectures over the last year where you said that's precisely what you were attempting to do, to displace 1776 with 1619. She even had for a while on her Twitter banner, the top of her page was the date 1776 crossed out and 1619 written below it. And you're like, wait a minute, you're going on CNN and what you're saying is an outright lie. And it's an outright lie to cover yourself from criticism. So I start thinking, I said, well, I remember she gave interviews claiming that 1619 was the true founding. And I thought, wait a minute, the original published version of the 1619 Project from the previous August, didn't it have some text to that effect? So I go and open up the New York Times' webpage, go all the way back to 2019 and the original article, and the text is gone. The text claiming that 1776 was not our true founding, 1619 is, or to that effect, it's gone. It's been removed from the article. I'm like, wait a minute, I swear I saw this. So I dug up an archived copy from the Wayback Machine.
Right.
And it turns out that the New York Times had ghost edited this line out of its own newspaper. They just sent it down the memory hole. They deleted it. And I was able to pinpoint the timing. It turns out they deleted it like right before the Pulitzer Prizes were announced, and they were taking some criticisms. They were in Pulitzer contention. So there's a very clear motive for wanting to make this controversial line go away. And they did exactly that in the text. So I wrote an article about it, and it caused enough of a storm that Brett Stevens, an editorial writer at the New York Times, actually mentioned it in his column and tried to contact Nicole Hannah-Jones and say, what the hell, what's going on here? This is beyond the pale. You've breached journalistic ethics by ghost editing your previously published work without disclosing that you did so. And she just reacted with visceral attacks on Stevens, denial that she ever did any of that, just all sorts of really non-believable excuses to try to pretend that this was not an issue. So it's a breach of journalistic ethics at its core, and yet it's been accepted as tolerated and normal within the world of the New York Times. They decided to stand by her. I mean, this was an occasion where I think if we had an ethical newspaper that adhered to journalistic standards, the New York Times would have fired Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jake Silverstein and some of the other editorial figures that were involved in the 1619 Project for that deception. Not because they engaged in bad journalism, but because they breached a basic norm of journalistic ethics. And yet they decided to stand by them.
They were busy turning the newsroom against people like Barry Weiss that was questioning some of their decisions.
Oh, that's exactly it. And you see this. I almost joke sometimes that it seems like Nicole Hannah-Jones's main job at the New York Times is not as a reporter, not as a writer. I mean, she barely writes anything. I think she's published maybe 2-3 articles in the entire 2-year period since the 1619 Project came out. Well, 2.5 years now. So you ask the question, what does she do? Well, she tweets all day, and she seems to wage all these internal political battles at the New York Times to make the newsroom more woke and more aligned with her political opinions.
Yeah, I mean, she's a woke enforcer. The bottom line is, I mean, I'm a little angry that you're even available to be here, just because I think and she's on Meet the Press last month, and she's Chuck is trying to ask her a question about, the even people of color pushing back on CRT, and she just attacks him. She's like, I noticed you didn't mention white people. It's just like he slinks back into his place. I'm sure Brett Stevens realized he needed to keep his mouth shut after she
Yeah.
went after him. And that's
Yeah.
just the environment we're in today.
Well, it is, and she's a very aggressive projector of political vitriol against anyone that even mildly criticizes her or her arguments in particular. And, if you find a major flaw in the paper, if you discover that they ghosted the text of the 1619 project of the New York Times, I mean, you're persona non grata. That's why she hates me, because I've been a very persistent critic, and I've shown areas of the 1619 project that not only err factually, but that breach basic ethical norms, and that just makes someone like me a direct target of her. Some of the other historians as well have all faced similar types of attacks. It doesn't matter what criticism you make of her, her response is always to go on the personal attack. And she's done this to mainstream center-left historians. She's done this to people that are more in the classical liberal, libertarian, free market space like me. She's done it to far-left historians with the World Socialist website. She's done it with African-American critics. Her Twitter feed, I mean, it's just outright venomous, taking pictures of herself, making profane gestures at some of her African-American critics, just vitriol over and over again. And that's entirely on her. It didn't have to be that way after the 1619 project was published. And one of the points that I've made over and over again in my criticism of it is that Nicole Hannah-Jones's behavior and the New York Times' behavior and standing behind her after the 1619 project came out has come to taint and damage the reputation of the entire project, because all these other authors that wrote for it that weren't engaged in some of these very unprofessional antics are now saddled with what Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jake Silverstein and other people affiliated with the Times have not only encouraged but have embraced as their official response to their criticism.
I'd like to tie this to something you wrote in your article, The Case for Retracting Matthew Desmond's article.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Nicole Hannah-Jones and her response to critics. And part and parcel with the ad hominems, I think, is just a radical evasion of any counter evidence being presented. And one of the things you write in this article is you tell the story about Ed Baptist, who is a historian, I guess, who wrote the book The Half Has Never Been Told.
Yes.
He used some stats incorrectly, apparently, in that book, and then he ignored all the rebuttal evidence against him.
Right.
Just continued on, using his faulty premise. So basically, this was him evading his critics. And you have a paragraph in that article. I'd like to share it here, and I'll read it. It says, Baptist, much to the discredit of his professionalism, has subsequently adopted a strategy of refusing to engage with Olmsted and Rhodes' rebuttal. Those are the guys who showed that his evidence or his stats were wrong.
Yeah.
Instead, he brushes it aside and persists as if his own thesis is uninterrupted and unaltered in the face of clear contradictory evidence. I think that's a very powerful way of framing his problem, which is just this radical evasion. And evasion, of course, is a theme that Ayn Rand talked about a lot. And I'd like to read something she wrote about evasion. She wrote, thinking is man's only basic virtue. So thinking is man's basic virtue, from which all the others proceed. And his basic vice, the source of all his evils, is that nameless act which all of you practice, but struggle never to admit. The act of blanking out. And that was something she wrote in her novel Atlas Shrugged. And she refers to evasion as blanking out. She calls it a willful suspension of one's consciousness, the refusal to think. What do you think about that, and do you agree with Ayn Rand that this is a basic vice and essentially the core problem with these so-called historians putting forth the 1619 idea?
Yeah, yeah, I think what we're seeing here, and that Rand gets on this, and other authors have pointed out similar things, is when you engage in a scholarly enterprise, you have an obligation to meet valid criticisms and respond to valid criticisms. This is the premise of like the entire peer review process, is that if there are challenges that are raised to your work, and especially things like the factual accuracy of them or your use of other sources and material, you need to have an answer for that. And what we have with Baptist is he's basically just shirked that. Not only that, Desmond himself has adopted the same strategy in the 1619 project. So I actually just obtained last night a copy of Desmond's response, because when I raised this challenge to him over his use of Ed Baptist and the Olmsted and Rhodes statistics, I sent it to the New York Times and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? And they apparently asked Desmond for a response, and that was just forwarded to me last night. And I'll quote from it. This is Desmond writing, apparently. It says, Mr. Magness is correct that Baptist's torture thesis has been contested. Baptist made a causal claim linking violence to productivity on cotton plantations, specifically through his mention of the pushing system, where enslaved workers were tortured if they did not hit their daily quotas. This is Desmond again. My article did not make such a causal claim. So consider that. Now I'm going to read to you from Desmond's article here. Let me pull it up. Desmond's article in the 1619 project itself. Remember, you see, he just says in this email, I never made such a causal claim as Ed Baptist. But I'm quoting his article. Quote, plantation owners used a combination of incentives and punishment to squeeze as much possible out of enslaved workers. Some beaten workers passed out from the pain and woke up vomiting. Some danced and trembled with every hit. An 1829 first-person account from Alabama recorded an overseer shoving of faces of women that he thought had picked too slow into their cotton baskets and opening up their backs. To the historian Edward Baptist, before the Civil War, Americans, quote, lived in an economy whose bottom gear was torture, end quote. So there's Matthew Desmond in the 1619 project versus what he's telling the New York Times. I'll leave that to your listeners. Did Desmond make a causal claim when he said plantation owners used a combination of incentives and punishments to squeeze as much possible out of enslaved workers? I'd say he absolutely did. And not only that, he cites it directly to Ed Baptist. And yet when he's challenged before the New York Times, his response is, no, I never did that.
Yeah, it's like some of the things that you tried to bring up to other people about the 1619 project and changes that should be made. And they take the same attitude. They just don't even care. They'll just say whatever's needed to get past the news cycle. And then they're just going to keep teaching it to kids with the original version.
Right. There's no correction that's been made. The only change that they've announced, or at least change that they've been open about, other than the ghost edits, was they altered one phrase in the text after their own fact checker, Leslie Harris, revealed that she had cautioned Nicole Hannah-Jones against claiming the American Revolution was motivated by protecting slavery. And they, after that blew up in their face, the New York Times was forced to make a very small edit to slightly concede the point that they had overstated there.
Yeah. Well, one of the best parts about following you on Facebook and Twitter is also the way you push back on the libertarian left. Yeah. We mentioned it earlier. I had my own run-ins with them, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because I do like some of them, but sure. I've seen some support Antifa or writing that libertarians should be social justice warriors, and that just, to me, I get the sense that some of them have morphed into a type of good cop of the left. They're like, we don't want the left forcing you to do all these things, but you should do them voluntarily. And
yeah, they've also adopted.
What you think motivates them?
Yeah. I think a lot of them have actually adopted a very visceral anti-capitalistic rhetoric as well. So that they've, libertarian thought has historically been moored to economics, to economic reasoning. And you see this in all iterations of libertarian thinkers, all the way from someone like von Mises in the Austrian school, it's a direct mooring in economic thought as the core of liberal values. You also see it in someone like Rand, who's making a moral case for economic reasoning as a core classical liberal libertarian value. What you see on the left libertarians today is they've actually rejected quite a bit of that, and in its place they've adopted like this garbled and cribbed version of like this pretty standard left-wing Marxism. The idea that they think that workers are exploited and capitalists gain their ownership of capital through ill-begotten ways, and that the labor theory of value, that some have even tried to rehabilitate that. Really kooky fringe ideological left-wing stuff for various reasons has taken root in elements of the libertarian left. And once they discard economics, once they shun anything rooted in economics, it's kind of like off to the races to crazy left-wing ideological stuff with a very, very light attentiveness to civil rights and civil liberties, although as we saw in the pandemic, quite a few of them were willing to forego those as well. So you ask the question is, what is left about these people that is even remotely libertarian? I just don't see it.
Exactly. And they spend more time going after you with much more vitriol than wokeists that think libertarianism itself is racist.
That is exactly it. I'm the bad guy because I don't welcome the far left wokist approach into libertarian thought, and by creating a challenge to something like the 1619 Project or something like the lockdowns or whatever their cause of the month happens to be, critical race theory, I'm creating a barrier to the left. Somehow the left that automatically has declared that libertarianism is racist and capitalist and evil and needs to be discarded.
Yeah. You talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and Bill Walton and how she says it's not about being objective scholars when it comes to promoting CRT. Yeah. I mean, I think that should be the main line of attack against it, that they've explicitly, in some cases, given up objectivity. I feel like, Rand talked about the sanction is part of the problem that even you're still trying to patiently persuade an objective audience of academics that may not even exist much anymore.
Right. Well, and part of it is leaving a record outside of the academy, making available resources outside of the academy, because I do see something like that, like critical theory in general has a very antithetical track record, not only to objective truth, but to honesty in the representation of its data, its evidence, which is related in that once you shun objective truth, facts become these fluid things that can be enlisted in favor of narratives or to tear down things that are disliked. It's off to the races of really crazy territory, and yet that's what seems to have taken hold over large swaths of the academy right now. So when I write, I'm not writing for the academy other than holding their feet to the fire. I'm writing in ways that those of us in the general public can look upon and evaluate the evidence and come to their own conclusions. And I'm still hopeful that there is some respect to basic honesty and truth outside of the academy that seems to be increasingly deprecated inside of the academy.
You think that the academy is a hopeless cause or a lost cause? Do you think that it's irreparable? Because when I look at what's going on with many of these academics, they seem to just be focused on putting out arbitrary assertions and never trying to back them up at all.
I think that's absolutely the case. The ideology is first. These are people that have adopted a very far left worldview, and they think that that's their only truth. And they use that worldview. They go cherry pick sources, including sources of very dubious quality and rigor, to prop up that worldview while also ignoring all other sources and anything that contradicts it.
Seems like this is almost like a psychological issue. Like they're incapable of getting out of their own fantasy world in their own mind.
I've joked before that academia, for the first time in human history, has managed to figure out not only to turn craziness into a career, but to figure out how to get it subsidized by the taxpayers.
Yeah, only the government would fund this.
Yes.
I think of woke as similar to early Christians in the latter days of the Roman Empire.
Well, I think there are just more broad religious elements that you can see in movements, not only wokeism, but the COVIDians themselves, the people that have become addicted to lockdowns. It's no longer about science. It's no longer about fact or truth. It's about a profession of faith to a certain set of ideas. But instead of a traditional religion, a political religion has taken its place, and that political religion is both a worship around the authority of the state, provided that they are in charge of the state. It's also a worship around sending certain signals of virtue, certain signals of behavior that makes them in their minds better people than the masses of society. And I think that's a really dangerous outlook to take for social interaction.
Absolutely.
I know we're running out of time, but if I can squeeze in one other issue,
Yeah.
is there a way to relate this whole idea of the lockdowns or the passion behind the lockdowns? Do you think it's related to the passion you see now behind the anti-unvaccinated movement and all of these vaccine mandates and IDs and all that? Is this just another manifestation of whatever hysteria is going on?
Well, I think it's transferred over into that. And it's complicated by the fact that, you've got some pretty fringe anti-vax people out there. There are also valid reasons to critique things like vaccine mandates. And I've been personally in favor of getting vaccinated, especially if you are in a vulnerable age group, or you have medical reasons that make your own condition highly vulnerable. Yeah, it's a valuable tool, but at the same time, forcing it as a one size fits all on all of society through a mandate is it's a violation of basic principles of liberty, principles of right. And it's also being done in a very inept, unscientific way, because it's not recognizing things like natural immunity. Now they're getting to the territory of not only mandating vaccines, but mandating boosters to go on college campuses and things like that. So it's like this never-ending cycle of ratcheting up more and more restrictions. And you ask the question, are they doing this for scientific reasons? And it appears quite a bit of the evidence says, no, they're not. They're actually doing it for reasons of political motive, or signaling virtue, of trying to separate the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. So they have a point of scapegoat, a point of blame for the fact that this pandemic is not over. It's just a succession of motives that come in of that nature that are unmoored from scientific evidence and fact. And I think that's a ripe recipe for government abuse.
Can we see or will we see a declaration like the Great Barrington Declaration, but one for these vaccine mandates?
It's hard to say what a scientist would do in terms of that. I know I've been speaking out against the mandates while also speaking out in favor of making vaccines widely available and accessible to those who want and need it. That's been my whole approach basically since vaccination started. And I think it's a continuation of raising the alarm that there is a ratchet effect when you start going down the route of vaccine mandates and passports. This is intrusion into other areas of life. It's an intrusion into privacy. It's a surveillance mechanism. It's a mechanism to divide society in ways that don't make scientific sense, but are often very useful for political reasons. So I think continuing to make that case is about the best we can do right now.
Don't you see economic costs as well? Because there's all the time spent going to get these tests and all the business lost because vaccine people unvaccinated can't go into certain areas. Like they wouldn't let me sit down at my favorite pizza joint and sit inside the restaurant because I'm unvaccinated.
Well, I only halfway joke that places like New York City and some of the other areas that have adopted these vaccine passport style mandates and rules, it's like they're turning every single store and restaurant into the airport TSA line.
Right.
You have to stand there and show your card to be approved to make it past the security. And that's a pretty horrifying future of society if all of New York City is going to be a perpetual TSA line for as long as this thing persists. And I don't think anyone's really paying much attention to the long-term societal harms in that respect of going down that route. And I go back to the 9/11 example. The TSA is still with us. It's very strong case that it hasn't really done much at all to effectively deter terrorism, and yet we're still burdened with it 20 years later. So are we going that route with COVID? I hope not, but there are certainly signs to be on the lookout for.
Well, Phil, I just got to thank you again, just for fighting the good fights. There's just too little of it going on. I'm thrilled about what you're doing. I don't know if you have any other kind of big fights on the horizon, but I saw even some, I don't even know who this guy is, Woody Holton, USC. He wouldn't debate you because he didn't want to legitimize you on 1619 after, wanting to debate someone like George Will, who's much easier. And it bothers me that we're in a place where like the right people aren't getting recognized. And I just, people do appreciate your work and it's important. And I'm glad you're out there.
I appreciate that. I genuinely do.
Good.
Yeah, I'd just like to chime in too. I've been reading a lot of your articles to prepare for this interview, and I have to say that I found your writing to be very clear and persuasive, and I've never really wanted to click on more source links than in your articles.
It's good to hear. I try to lay it all out. So
yeah, you make a powerful case for everything, and you make the topic more interesting where I want to go in depth and find out all the information you have. So yeah. I'm also glad that there are people like you out there coming up with this information, seeking it out and delivering it to everybody, all your readers and your audience. And just thank you again for doing this interview. And I hope to talk to you again sometime.
Sounds good.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.